Hi, everyone, and welcome to the MLOps podcast. I'm Dean, your host, and today I have with me Uri Goren. Uri is the founder and the CEO of Argmax, which is an ML consulting firm focusing on search and recommendations. Before that, he was the founder and CTO at Best Practice, a legal tech startup. And even before that, he was a data scientist and researcher at AT&T, Yahoo, and Microsoft. So, Uri, thank you for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. So, diving into things, um, we're going to be talking today about cookies, at least part of the time. And some of the audience might be familiar with what that is. We'll talk about that in a moment. But you're a very serious machine learning professional. And I'm curious, when did you start thinking about cookies?
So, in the last year, we heard more and more the phrase the cookieless future, which sounds kind of worrying, but it's part of a global trend regarding regulations such as GDPR and CCPA, which are more centered about privacy. Now, as an ML practitioner, you might ask why should we care? But actually, most of the features that we actually use in the advertising industry rely on identifying the user one way or another. So, in most cases, it has something to do with cookies.
Hmm. So, Uli, you're a very serious ML professional. And I'm curious, when did you start thinking about cookies?
So, anyone who's a bit involved in the advertising industry know that there's a global trend on privacy with regulations such as GDPR and CCPA, which essentially make it harder to identify users, which is bad for advertisers. But on the other hand, I think we live in a very exciting times regarding the achievements in deep learning and LLMs, as you probably had an episode or two about. And I think this is a perfect storm. We have, on the one hand, we have this new constraint that we can't really use cookies and identify users. On the other hand, we have this new capability that we can do very sophisticated logic on the content itself and analyze image and text. So it's a very interesting time to be doing machine learning in the advertising industry.
That's awesome. I think that the one way that I think the audience might want to think about this is that usually in the past there was a trade-off that had to be made between your privacy and how personalized ads were, and most people prefer to not give up their privacy, at least when they stop to think about it. And now we're getting to the point where we get more of our privacy back, but maybe we can still get personalized ads thanks to the new developments in technologies. And I think we're going to focus on this most of this episode. But because I'm guessing at least some of the people in the audience don't know what cookies are, or they have some vague idea, can you explain what are cookies and what are they used for?
Sure. So cookies is a pretty old concept. I think from the first days of the internet, like I think that Netscape was the company that actually introduced them. And the main idea is as follows. When you visit a new website, it injects or saves an identifier. This is the cookie that the next time you're going to visit the same website, they can know it's a returning user and not a brand new user. Now, cookies are being used either to save your login when you log into Gmail and visit the next day, or to help the advertiser or the website owner to keep what you have in the cart or the items that you actually watched or purchased, or even to do cross-site advertising, right? Also known as retargeting.
Hmm. So now that we understand what cookies are and why they might be used, and I think most people immediately understand what might be the problems with doing these things, because obviously when you're in a certain context, maybe you're in Amazon, you're shopping around, then that's fine. Like, you want Amazon to remember your preferences because you're in the mode for shopping when you're there. But then maybe you don't want to see ads for the things that you shopped on, especially if they're like personal things in other sites. and that's what we used to have with cookies. But I guess, is that the reason that they're going away? Like why are they going away right now?
So there's definitely a privacy concern. This is not a new privacy concern. Like a
Mm-hmm.
very funny story from years back. A friend of mine, when he was about to propose to his wife, to his nowadays wife, then be, because of cookies, she knew beforehand, right? She's seen a lot of advertisement for engagement rings. So there's definitely a concern here. But I think that the timing about 2024 is mostly because of regulations. So we probably heard about GDPR, and there's also more local regulations. If I recall correctly, Montana has also its own regulations about privacy in various states in the United States, and it become harder and harder to operate and to comply with all of the different countries and states regulations with regards to identifying users and all of the policies, opt in, opt out. It's a very complicated um, domain these days. And those of us that are using, for example, iPhone, know that from the last few updates, I think iOS 14, 14, 14 and a half, actually, Apple started to ask users whether they want to be tracked, meaning whether they want to actually give the app developer their identifier or not. So it became very apparent what apps are trying to track you and whatnot.
I remember installing that update and starting to get the questions and realizing that it's basically every other app. But nowadays, it seems like that's no longer the case, or at least maybe I already accepted or rejected all of the app's questions. But I guess, like, if I remember correctly, GDPR and I think one of the US equivalents is also CCPA. Like, they're not super new, right? Like they've been here for a while. What changed this year that it seems like more people are talking about this and it seems maybe more actionable?
So I guess that most of these regulations came out circa 2020, uh,
Hmm.
but we also had another major event on 2020. And the Fed probably didn't want to rock the boat too much. So now that we are a few years past the COVID and the lockdowns, and the economy seem to be more stable, now it's the time that they're actually starting to enforce and trying to promote the privacy regulations. And 2024 is marked as the cookieless year, in which most advertisers are trying to figure out how to deal with regulations. And for example, even I think that 2 months ago in October, Google actually announced that the new Google Chrome would not support third-party cookies. And there are other um, vendors. I think that Apple also announced that someday they're going to have a VPN, so you won't be able to track IP addresses. So privacy became a real concern in most major players.
Hmm. So I think that that's. It seems like there's going to be a tectonic shift this year. A lot of things are going to happen. But maybe now that the listeners have sort of this context on cookies, how they're being used, why they're not going to be here for long. How is ML leveraging cookies in the advertising industry today?
Okay, so in the cookie full world, what an ML engineer or data scientist usually do is try to build a user profile, right? So if I know that Dean is browsing my site, I can try and build a profile. What kind of fashion items or products does he usually look at? What is his history? What other website did I see Dean browsing? And I can only do that because I know Dean's ID, right? Whether it's a cookie or an actual like ID that his mobile device give me. And this is a very important feature for a very important identifier for a lot of features. There are whole families of algorithms. For example, in recommendation systems, you have like two different approaches: the content filtering and the collaborative filtering. Collaborative recommendation systems rely on identifying users and tracking them over time. If you're not able to do that, then it's going to be a lot harder to recommend items in a personalized way.
I see. Yeah, I think that um, maybe the way I think about this is when you're a data scientist in general, especially if you're working with tabular data, then your job is to find the best features and then fit a model to those features so that you get the whatever expected output or prediction. And a lot of these features in the ad industry, as far as I know, both from talking to you and talking to other people that work on these challenges, are based on the user history because it's a very rich data source that you can look at to better understand who the person is. And then when we're looking forward, we now get that rug pulled under us, and there's no more of those features, which again, I think has a very positive upside, which is that users get to maintain their privacy. I don't know, more tightly. But how do we solve this? Like, what ML trends are going to come up next to try to fill in the gaps, and how is filling the gaps even going to look like?
So I think that when we're talking about advertising and finding and personalization in general, there are like there's a triangle of three different vertices. One of them is audience, understanding your user and the user history. The other is the content. Where is this ad going to be? Is it going to be on the billboard? Is it going to be in a newspaper? If it's going to be in a newspaper or a news site, what's the exact article going to talk about? And the third one is the context or intent. For example, if I reach that news article via Google search, what was my query, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did I search for how to find a new scooter? Then maybe it doesn't really matter what is the article about. I know that the user has a very high intent of purchasing a new scooter, right? Very
Mm-hmm.
specific. So since the cookies are going away and we can't really build a user audience anymore, we need to rely more on those two remaining vertices, right? So the content and the context, the intent and what's actually being presented on the page or the app.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then like how do we extract information from that? Or how is information extracted today and how is that going to change in the next year?
So there are essentially two approaches. Um, One of them is more probabilistic, like trying to segment users and to cluster users together. For example, I
Mm-hmm.
might not know that you're Dean with ID 123, whatever, but I might know that you're browsing from your iPhone on 2 a.m. and I don't know, in New York or whatever. And that might be helpful, if I'm going to advertise Uber Eats or something that could be very specific to your context.
Mm-hmm.
So these methods are called probabilistic models, and they mostly rely about segmenting users together. And you're not trying to aim for a specific action, but to evaluate the overall probability of that specific segment.
Mm-hmm.
For example, Apple in the recent scan model, scan is an identifier between 1 and 100. Essentially, they let the advertisers enumerate 100 clusters, which is a very, very small number, and to target only only those. And 100 numbers is essentially 7 features. So we don't have a lot of information. Like
Mm-hmm.
think about like how much information you can squeeze in 7 bits of information that doesn't give you a lot of wiggle room.
Yeah.
So this is like the umbrella term for probabilistic models. Another alternative, which I'm very bullish about, is using contextual features. For example, understanding what is on the page. If this article is talking about e-scooters, that's amazing. I can analyze the images, I can understand the text, and we have very interesting tools like ChatGPT and other computer vision models, and we can actually do things that we weren't really able to do 10 years ago. So a lot of
Mhm.
new options are being available, being open these days.
Interesting. So how I guess maybe starting with the end, like with contextual features, obviously like doing this with ChatGPT or something like that seems to us now very, very easy. Was this something that was done somehow in the past, or was this just not done because everyone was relying on cookies?
So to be frank, if you can track your user, usually it gives better results because
Hmm.
if you know who's actually the user and you can build a lot of history, then that's probably preferable. Some websites and some vendors can still do that. For example, Google, most of the actions that you do on Google or on Amazon, you're logged in, so they do not need the help of third-party cookies. They can just build a user profile, and they would probably keep on doing so. In the past, for example, when I used to work at Yahoo, we've been asked not to show advertisements for airlines on articles that mentions um, air, airlines collisions or any flight
Accidents.
related accidents, and that was really hard to do. Right, think about the technologies that we had like 10 years ago, like bag of words and keyword matching and regular expressions. It's really hard to figure out if it mentions a collision in air or something like that. And these days, it sounds like an API call to OpenAI, right? Sounds like very simple to do.
Yeah, that's sounds like a very hard problem to solve in the world before LLMs, and now we have that covered. I think you touched also on a really important point, which is what's going away is mostly the third party aspect of cookies. So cookies originally, I think, before someone figured out that you can use them for ads, were also used to just maintain context on the user within a website. So if you're logged in, I know things about you, so I can, I don't know, customize the whether or not you prefer dark mode or light mode if we're talking in modern times. Um, and so if you're logged in, that information can still be attributed to your user, and you don't really have that benefit, or not the benefit, but the challenge of not having cookies. So when you're going into Amazon, they'll still have the information of the things that you looked at in the past, and they'll be able to show you things that are sort of related to things you viewed in previously. I think that's how they define the category. But things that they could have done before was maybe if you looked at I think you gave the example of a scooter on Amazon, then you'd go to Facebook and suddenly see an ad for a scooter that you might buy. Like that's not going to happen as much probably. And then I'm curious because you mentioned this the scan protocol specifically. Like you have 100 segments. You that means like I think the calculation is like that's seven binary features. So how do you deal with that? Like the can you segment this by location? I don't know, by campaign or something like that. How are advertisers supposed to handle such a small amount of different categories?
So, as you mentioned, 100 segments is a very low number, and it kind of resembles challenges that we used to have in the field of actually compression, right? Like Hoffman codes, and how do you encode a lot of information when you have very limited space? And there are very interesting works about how can you use the same bit for several segments, for several features, and try to handle collisions and some higher order logic. And if you also take into account that most of these features are not stationary,
Mm-hmm.
right? For example, if you advertise on December when everybody's still in the holiday season, and you're trying to learn something meaningful for January, a lot of things change. So you need to sample those features again and again. It becomes a very challenging problem.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, you wanted to say something. Sorry.
By the way, as you mentioned, the problem is with third-party cookies, meaning that if you own the data, you can still identify users and do the machine learning work as we did before. There's a conspiracy theory that mentions that the reason that the regulation starts from California is because, well, those this is where the tech giants are, right? So
Interesting.
essentially, Amazon and Facebook and Google are not that affected by this regulation as as much as the smaller players are.
Interesting. So giving the market maybe some time to adjust. Um, I think that one thing that was interesting to me about the idea of like putting things in 100 specific buckets and having only those is my background is partially physics, and I think that the we're getting to the point where you define a distribution function over where the users are, which has much more than 100 categories, and then in the end you sort of collapse the user function into one of those 100 buckets. And I think that that's going to. I'm curious if people are already developing these things, and if not, I'm going to bet that we're going to see things like that in the next year or two. But yeah, I don't know if you have other thoughts on technologies that you expect to be developed to address this more effectively.
Yeah, also we need to keep in mind that even if you're tracking like 7 features, those are usually dependent on each other. For example, I guess that iPhone is the most popular, Apple is the most popular manufacturer in the States. So if I know that the user is from the United States, it's more likely that she's using an Apple device. Maybe I don't need to keep track of the device as much. Maybe I can use only one of those features.
Hmm.
And it's a really interesting problem, especially as the distribution shifts over time, right? Maybe in a few years, this won't be the case. So I need to update the way I encode the data.
Yep. Yeah, I think that it's going to be interesting. Like, also, how do you define these buckets? Yeah, over time, how do you do models that maybe build models that learn these meta features and translate them into these different categories while the user is there? Uh, because you can save the information later on, so you need to do everything in like real time, right? Like that's part of the challenge here. Um, but yeah, it's going to be a very interesting time. I guess taking a step back and maybe asking a few higher level questions that I like to ask all my guests. What are your thoughts on like what's currently the hardest unsolved problem in the machine learning and AI space?
So I think that while we have a lot of exciting achievements in deep learning, doing deep learning at scale is still not a solved problem, right? We have a lot of infrastructure costs. It's usually not as fast. It's very costly. And I think that we
Hmm.
still haven't figured out what is like the standard way of doing deep learning on scale and in production. And to put that in perspective, like we do have a standard for structured data. Usually we have one form of another of an SQL dialect that we're using, whether if it's, I don't know, Oracle or MySQL or Snowflake, but we
Hmm.
handle mostly tabular data the same. We don't have one language or one protocol how to deal with deep learning. It's still very shaky.
Hmm. Interesting. So you think that that's I guess do you think that that's going to be solved anytime soon, or is this like a problem that's here to stay with us for a while?
So we do see a few standards emerging. It's still, I think, too soon to determine how would the infrastructure look like.
Hmm.
For example, we do see vector stores become more and more dominant. Like that's definitely a
Hmm.
trend.
Yeah. And so I'm also seeing trends of unifying vector stores with the regular SQL databases, which is going to be interesting. But yeah, but I agree with you. I guess what in that context, or maybe in a similar context, like what are your predictions for the next year in AI and ML? How is our world going to look differently?
So I think there's no really doubt that we're going to see LLMs being used more and more. However, I do think that currently people just plug LLMs as chatbots.
Mhm.
And I personally don't think this is the way to go because you don't have too much control about what an LLM might say to your end users. It might, put you at risks or just hallucinate. And in most cases, you don't want to be accountable for the hallucinations of an LLM. However, I do think that LLMs could be a very crucial part from a pipeline, meaning that if you use LLMs to structure output, for example, to carve out the sentiment from a customer complaint. Now, if I expect the sentiment to be like positive or negative, then
Yeah.
this is the kind of structured output that I can use in a consequent step in a pipeline, right?
Mhm.
So I put most of my chips on using LLMs for structured output.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think that the this relates to the previous episode that was released of the MLOps podcast. I spoke with Jason about a system that he developed called Instructor that takes structured outputs out of LLM outputs. And the main point he was making that is not that the technology is like he used that framework to teach people about how to think about using LLMs for structured use cases. But the main point is the world is not driven by chat. The world is driven by software and APIs and more structure, at least right now. And the question is, how do you use this super powerful tool that we got in a way that interacts with the rest of the world that we can build? And the moment you get that, then you get a lot of applications that are currently just impossible or very, very hard to do. So I think I agree with you that that's going to be a priority for a lot of organizations because that's how they make it actually make an impact and not just something that's nice to have and talk to your maybe investors or even customers about, but then it's not super useful. I guess in the spirit of controversial takes, can you tell me something that is true about machine learning and AI, but that few people would agree with?
I do think that LLMs are being overused these days. Like a lot of the use case that I see for LLM classifications might be solved with simpler models like either classical bag of words models or even in some cases just regular expressions.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that you can use an LLM doesn't mean that it's like the appropriate solution. LLMs are usually very, very costly.
Yeah, I think that the if you have a hammer, not like you shouldn't think everything is a nail. And also, I think that there's a lot of trade-offs that need to be made when you're using larger models, and you need to make them consciously, and not just because it's the shiniest tool in the in the industry. Um, and I guess to finish off. Curious like what your recommendations are for the audience, and it doesn't have to be related to data science and machine learning.
So I think one of the recent books that kind of changed the way that I try to manage my time and my business
Mm.
is a book called "Buy Back Your Time" by actually I'm going to need to look it up. Um,
We'll put the link afterwards. Don't worry about it.
yeah, but it's really it really prioritizes the way that you manage your time, but by looking at your calendar and then trying to hire the people that actually would take the most time out of your calendar and
Mm.
not like trying to optimize for your business, because the main theme of the book is that people trying to promote their business and they end up suffocating their time and being like overexhausted just because they don't have time anymore.
Hmm.
So the book tries to first you hire people just to clear out your calendar and only then think about what's good for your business, which is a very refreshing view.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that there's this thing where I don't remember where I heard this first. Maybe from Naval Ravikant, who's talking about like um, your time being worth money, and you can estimate at what point it's worth for you to hire someone to take on specific tasks that you need to get done in order to make that time available to do other things that are more important. I also think that one of the recommendations that I wanted to make is I'm now reading a book called Getting Things Done. Thanks, Eddie, for the recommendation. And the main idea is that you need to consciously manage your time and your tasks in order to make the most of it. And a lot of times, at least for me, I felt like we're in pretty intense jobs. There's a lot of inputs. There's a lot of things happening, and at least I feel like I have a decent memory, so I try to keep a lot of things in my head. But the idea of like writing things down and organizing it actually empties some headspace, which you can then use to think about the bigger things. And I think what you described is one of those bigger things. Like, where is my time being spent, and why is it spent there? And am I the bottleneck to do that, or is this something that other people can do, and that will let me focus on things that are maybe more important? And of course, it's a very, I guess, privileged point of view, but I think that for a lot of people that are listeners, this would apply to their lifestyle, and this might be a thing that they can use to spend more time on the things that they define as important. I think that's a great recommendation. Do you have any ML related recommendations?
So regarding ML, I think that looking into the various frameworks that we have for structured output is very helpful. We have a library called the JSON Former and Guidance by Microsoft, and probably many more. But what most of them actually do is that they override the decoder part. Decoder is a search algorithm, by making a language model actually comply with a certain JSON schema. And that's like very, very helpful and also very cheap to implement. Like, you don't need some fancy, you don't need some fancy algorithm or fine tuning.
Awesome. So I think this is a great point to wrap up on. Uri, thank you so much for taking the time to join the podcast today. It's a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And, bye, everyone. I'll see you next time.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the MLOps podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please like the video or subscribe. If you have any feedback, leave a comment below. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.